and it's an appropriate day to talk about my work. I thought I would maybe talk about a little bit about me. I'm not a trained artist. I'm not a trained artist. I have a different background, but I have come to the arts as an appreciator of all the arts. I love looking at the arts and thinking about them and studying them and trying to extract some messages. And then, you know, everyone can take up those drawing pencils and brushes and they can create their own art. And as someone told me, we should never stop creating. So I think that that's really important. So I came to painting late in life, and I actually came to this particular painting, my introductory piece, after going out with some friends to one of those paint and sip events, where the very nice art teacher was having people do one thing, and she handed everyone a certain shape, half of a wagon wheel, and it didn't speak to me. But as I started to take the wagon wheel and turn it around, I realized that this actually does speak to me. It speaks to me about things that I am passionate about and care about and think about, and also things in my family. And so I started to realize that it really started looking like the back, like a gun turret window out of a World War II plane. And as many of you in the audience know, one of my uncles was, in fact, a gunner in one of these planes in World War II and was shot down. And he would have recognized that sort of shape of the panels of glass and looking out on the territory that he had to protect and fight against and shoot to kill. Mm-hmm. And I was also moved by a book that my son, Leo, stand up, you're here in the audience too. Hey. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. My son was reading the book Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, who is in fact a Cornell alum. And you got me red. And that there's some amazing pictures that Kurt Vonnegut paints in that book, and one of them is you know, people like the soldiers, instead of going from their high schools and, you know, and their football teams and going to the battlefield, he has this imagination where they start at the battlefield and kind of drop their weapons and drop their uniforms and they kind of go back in time and put on their football, you know, their high school football uniforms and go back into the classroom, and that's of course where they should be. And he also talks about how, you know, if you could just shoot, yeah. So he kind of reimagines what the battlefield should really be looking like. Another inspiration for me when I was thinking about looking the gunner in these turrets, what they were looking out at, which was for them grim and scary and destructive and terrible. Was some of the Banksy artwork that we see sometimes, where people with guns are actually shooting bouquets of flowers out of them, and they're all masked up and looking like terrorists, and yet they're shooting flowers and things like that. And so that's a much better use for a projectile weapon than shooting bullets. So I kind of put these things together and thought, you know, it would be much better if you can have this turret, the gunner in the turret, and he's shooting out flowers, wildflowers, and different types of beautiful things onto a verdant plain with the blue sky and just, you know, in peace and beauty all around him. It would have been such a better situation, scenario, and experience for the gunner, for all of us, for Earth. And so that's what I decided to paint, was just if all of those dogfights and battles were just showering other people on Earth with flowers instead of bullets and bombs and things that were harmful. And it's a World War II plane turret, but of course laying those flowers down on a World War I battlefield is even more poignant, and especially since we're thinking about Armistice Day today. So that's how this came to fruition. That's what my thoughts were. I'm happy to take questions. David Krause.
So I think you shared with me that the rest of the teacher had instructed the rest of the class to paint something different.
or something similar.
Yes.
And then you decided you wanted to go in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to describe that and whether you had felt pressure to do the conventional way and what made you break out of that conventional way to do something really remarkable like this?
It's an interesting, phenomenon. I feel like I might not have done this particular thing if I hadn't gotten there a touch early, and already started kind of looking at the half wagon wheel before my friends came and before other people started coming into the room. But it was a paint and sip event, and I didn't know what a paint and sip event was before I went. And so what I understood after the paint and sip experience was that you're supposed to follow what the teacher does. And it's very nice because they teach you techniques to draw the things that the teacher has to, put together. And so what she had the class kind of learn how to draw was like more of a very pretty scene with like a wagon wheel and irises coming up and a fence post and things like that, and grass and the sky. And so everybody was kind of learning how to paint those things and how to do contouring and how to make the wagon wheel look like it was 3D. So it was really useful. But I had already sort of struck out on my own before the lesson started. And done something that nobody else was doing and didn't understand, and it's always hard to go off on your own like that, especially in a group situation where you're supposed to be doing something else. It's the whole purpose of going was to do that particular other painting, but you have to sort of muscle through those uncomfortable moments. You do, and like at the end, I'm although you want to support that event, this was a teacher, so you want to support that teacher, but I was just driven to do this instead, and I just had to follow that. And so yes, there was certainly peer pressure to do what the actual event was supposed to be about. It was probably misunderstood what I was doing when I was there, misunderstood both in like why I chose to do this and what this meant, but also like why I was doing it during the event. Why didn't I just do this on my own time? Like there was certainly misunderstandings, and I did get some side eyes and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I am glad I did this because I find that it's actually something that is a reminder about good things, but also bad things, but mostly good things.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Pierre.
So I noticed, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your art with us. It's lovely. I noticed that you have these terrestrial organisms, these poppies, and they seem to be disembodied from the earth, floating as if you're floating through a sea of these things. So when you were composing this photograph, they seem to occupy this liminal space between heaven and earth.
Oh, wow.
Is that something that you were thinking of when you wrote this? The fact that these are sort of these terrestrial bodies attached to the earth, attached to both life and death, and at the same time they occupy the green space of the earth and the blue sky of heaven. Is that something that you were thinking? Because it really comes across as this very dynamic and...
That's really interesting. I'm not sure I was thinking about it in those terms. I was thinking about it more as these things were floating from an armada, sort of these big gun warplanes that were going through. So there's some above you, there's some here, and they're just being sort of like they're just showering from above you and to the side and below you. They're just showering the earth with these things, but they're benevolent things instead. But I didn't think about the fact that they are floating in between heaven and earth, as like in the Eastern tradition, and are a part and not a part of both. Maybe now that you say that, when I see some of these shapes and how they're kind of these sort of curved shapes, it also sort of reminds me of a book I read, which is an excellent book, Persepolis, and I know that several of you have read Persepolis, when the author talks about how in Iran they convinced young kids to go and fight in the jihads and stuff, and how they would promise them all these crazy things, and she had this, but then of course they'd just be cannon fodder. They would just be the first ones out there and just blow up and kill these young, innocent, silly boys, and she has this drawing in this graphic novel of their bodies just kind of kind of being blown up from Earth, just like this, actually being blown up into the air, and they actually do kind of look like this, but and this is, you know, it can touch on so many battlefields. It's such an improvement on so many phases of battle and battlefields of war. So it's just a vast improvement to see these flexible, limp flowers be in that liminal space of between heaven and earth rather than people's bodies.
And you are coming from the perspective of a gun turret.
Yes.
And your central feature, when you zero in on the center, I think it's very optimistic as well, that you choose this as your central almost target. It's these poppies,
Yeah.
a sign of death and remembrance, tend to occupy the space that is in a heavenly space.
Interesting. Yeah. Leo.
Well, I was wondering why you chose the particular setting, how you chose to combine a World War II type plane with a more World War I style of setting with big open fields, rather than a World War II type setting, which would be more like a town or a city, as much of the fighting was. Why did you choose to combine those two
That's really
into
interesting.
into your scene?
That's really interesting. I feel like the field of war is both physical and metaphorical, and I feel that this field here, the green field, just kind of seemed like a more appropriate sort of resting place for all of these things that are coming out of the sky, trying to, that are being sent out of these planes and falling to Earth. And again, I think that I'm using the field of war and the battlefield as something maybe more metaphorical in terms of where all of these kind of these much better benevolent bullets are landing and these bombs are landing. And the fact that there's no one there and they're not hurting anyone, there's no destruction being happening. So it's an improvement on how we're fighting wars. And so you're right that I'm not sure I thought about the urban landscape in World War II. There is a limitation with my artistic technique as well, and I probably should admit that was part of it. That this was a little bit easier to paint, but I think that when you put in some of the human-made structures, it can become more specific to a time and a place and a particular type of battle, instead of just, this is what war really should look like. It should be sending flowers down on green fields in a healthy environment, instead of seeing something that's specific to a particular country or land, architecture. In my view of this, excellent question. Mom.
It's a comment. I'm trying to figure out how you came up with this sense of this vision of this wagon wheel, which I would always think of as a dusty prairie, people going to a new land and everything, and saw this and thought about this with it and looking at it as something that focused on something completely different that a wagon wheel represents, and you took the wagon wheel to represent something completely different.
Yeah, the wagon wheel
How
we
did you
got
come
was
up
like
with
a
that?
half wheel. It was just like a cutout, like a cardboard cutout sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
And so we all got one, and she, we were supposed to wait for the lesson to begin before we touched it. So I started picking it up and just kind of moving it around, and realized that this wagon wheels don't speak to me so much, but this, I feel like I have a much more of a connection to this type of story, since our uncle and my mom's brother, and just the cultural moment we're in, and just a better way of conducting like affairs on Earth. And the other thing I would say is it's true. There is this is also a wagon wheel that's been kind of reconstructed, and you're not seeing the full wagon wheel too. And that I have to say is a nod to my son Leo with his first selfie when he was 3 years old. When he did after his party, and he got all these trains and Thomas train sets and stuff like that, and he was just exhausted but still able to lie on his side and like press the go button on the train set so that he could still watch it go round and around. And he also somehow pressed the button on the camera and took a picture of himself. And let me get that because it's right
Is that how that picture was taken?
And it's also an
That's really
inspiration
interesting.
because it really reminds
That's
you
the
that
picture?
the things you're
The one
talking
we
about
were
don't
looking-
have to.
Oh yeah.
It's also
that picture is
4,000 pounds.
fantastic.
So
That is such a great picture.
right,
Yeah.
and
This
so
wasn't planned, I don't think.
yeah, and so this
Yeah,
picture reminds you. This was after his 3-year-old birthday party, and he was just transfixed with watching the trains, and and took a picture of himself. I mean, it's incredible, but it reminds you that like the physical thing that you're trying to show doesn't have to completely be in space. You know, you can cut off things, you can macro things. You know, it's a portrait of Leo, but he's we know that, but there's something very sweet about it just being his eyes, like that just become the center.
I love it.
And so here you don't even have the full turret, so I just kind of like the idea that you don't have to have the full thing either. And it still evokes the same thing. It can be a fragment of it, and you still know. Thank you, Leo, for taking that
Yeah.
and showing us that. It's also 400 pounds. At least the thing is like made out of lead and
That is a great picture. I always wonder how
you.
that became, how that happened.
Yeah.
I thought it was somebody that with a genius, eye for.
Well, when you see, so it was like a half that. It was just the spokes like that, But it was just a piece of cardboard. So you really could just use your imagination and when before I got the directive of what we were doing, it lets you kind of think about what it is. And I wanted to make something pretty too, and I like blue, and I like flowers, and I like green, and things like that.
Right. But I think it's amazing.
Thank
I
you.
mean, when I think about how you came up with it,
Yeah.
and the thought behind it.
And I think the fact that I started before she started her instructions, before it was put in my mind that
that you do something else, yeah.
Oh, I think she has a finished picture. I think I saw that it was a wagon wheel. I still know where we were going, and it wasn't something that I was really into.
So what were the other people that were doing this? What did they do with it?
They all did the wagon wheels.
They
I was
just
the
did
only
the wagon
one.
wheel? Yeah.
There's a group picture of us, and there are 25 wagon wheels. and they're all
And so
like,
they just
they're all
painted the
like
wagon wheel.
grays, and and then I actually. I mean, the thing is that when you go to the beat of your own drum, you also it does make it harder for other people sometimes. You are fulfilling something that you're interested in, but it does make it harder for somebody else. And so the teacher didn't have a lot of these lighter, prettier colors because it wasn't part of the painting that she was going to have everybody do. So I was kind of going up to the teacher desk and like taking paints that she hadn't planned for anybody to use.
Oh, I see.
And these are her own supplies that she's providing and all that kind of stuff. And so it was I have to say that she was very patient in letting me do that, but it was clearly I was completely overstepping what she had, the stuff that she had provided and wanted people to use, and I was using other stuff, other resources that that hadn't been sort of deployed for us. So it does impact other people when you go to the beat of your own drum. So, yeah.
Well, that's an amazing thing to me.
Yeah, I think
Once-
your
once you-
explanation of that
what- yeah,
makes a
what we-
lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that David's description and critique of the artwork, which is in the mounted next to it, I thought was terrific too.
Thank you.
And I really the whole thing was really
Yeah.
impressive.
Yeah,
I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Yes.
Did you have a question or a comment?
I just love this very much. I just love it. I think it's so creative from what Mom and Dad were saying. It's just so creative, and I think that it's meaningful. I think it's meaningful to you, but I think it's meaningful to me. And I just, interesting, because I first saw it and I just thought resilience. Because, of course, they did have World War II bombers flying over France, and they were flying over some of the old World War I battlefields, which by that time had, to a certain extent, healed. And so I think I just love it. And my question was, when did you come up with and how did you come up with the title?
Oh, that's an excellent question. That is a collaboration with my husband curator, David Krause. David, thank you. Thank you. I can't remember if you were the one who came up with the title. I think I was toying with the idea that it was about Verdun, or maybe, and you said Verdun reimagined, because it is a reimagination of a terrible war battle.
Yeah.
And a much better battle would have been this one.
Yeah.
Much better. And the way it was conducted the first time around should never be repeated.
Right. That's right.
Did your teacher did you have to explain this? Did somebody ask you what this was all about in that
Maybe
class?
one person, but no, they were not interested. No. Yeah. Leo.
What advice would you give to other young artists that kind of want to branch out like this in a situation where they might be pressured not to?
Oh yeah, I mean, we know so many stories, since we go to museums all the time, of the difficulty of artists to put food on their table when they're doing something that isn't profitable and what people aren't paying money for, and so it's really hard. I think there's always a side of every person that is an artist, and I think there's always a side of every artist that wants to do things that they really find meaningful, and you should do those pieces that you find really meaningful, and yet you don't have to be enslaved to that one thing that you find really meaningful, because the world as it is you also have to put food on the table, and there's room for both, I think. But I think in every artist and in every person, there's something that you want to do that might not be somebody else's cup of tea, but is meaningful to you, and you should absolutely pursue that for itself and for your own fulfillment. I do. Sophia.
Do you have any inspiration from other artists in your style?
I feel like there was a painting, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, there was a painting that also inspired me. It was in the Musée d'Orsay, a museum that you know, in Paris, that you're familiar with, and it was in the area that is the I think it was the Surrealist room, so kind of at the later period of the stuff that's in Musée d'Orsay, and there were two paintings of like knights in shining armor, sort of like a 19th century, idealization of this, medieval knight, kind of religious and mystical and stuff. And one is he's surrounded by sort of like field nymphs and just covered in flowers, and he's in this, these field nymphs are covered in every sort of flower, and he's in the middle of them. And there's another one where it's a knight, also kind of this quasi-mystical religious knight in sparkling armor, and I think he is surrounded by a lot of these types of floating flowers and stuff, and it's this really weird, like late 19th century, early 20th century, before World War I, just surrealist movement that was going on that just did very interesting things, ungluing things of the earth and letting them float, using flowers as a decoration, and decoupling them from their rooted sort of state. So I can't remember who that artist is. I can get back to you.
So I just want to applaud you again for an amazing execution. And so one of the things that I find fascinating about your painting, as I look more closely at it, is we're looking at these natural representations, these almost rural representations of the field and the sky and the flowers through the lens of this mechanistic war machine, right? Again, this sort of liminal space between our responsibilities and our viewpoints and our results. and the way that you connect World War I to World War II. World War I being the poppies, which are sort of canonical, the representation of the fallen soldiers, and World War II, the representation of the ball turret, and then the sky and the earth. And I just think that it's lovely the way you were able to execute the almost planted poppies at the bottom, right, with the floating poppies at the top, and you get this sense of dynamism, like the bomber is moving through this field of floating poppies. So I just think that there's a lot of things going on that show two dynamic tension between movement and being rooted, right? Heaven and earth, nature and man, war and peace. And I think you cover that really well here. So I think that's really extraordinary. I just want to applaud you on including
Yeah.
all these things in this painting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Well said, well said.
Thank you.